The Villains series by V.E. Schwab is a thrilling superhero sci-fi fantasy with a unique twist. Usually, novels in general, not just fantasy and sci-fi, but novels, follow a 3-act structure. The Villains series breaks from that norm and delivers a brilliant story, and here's how she did it. In a nutshell, the traditional 3-act structure consists of a beginning, middle, and end with rising tension up into a climax and then a resolution at the end of the story. Similar to Oppenheimer, however you pronounce it, the Villains series takes a sledgehammer to that structure. Instead of following a logical beginning, middle, end story structure, each of the books in the Villains Duology begin towards the end, jump back and forth all over the place, and then end with the end. Or at least that's how it appears. I was so intrigued by how random the structure appeared and also how well it worked that I hypothesized that it wasn't actually random, that there had to have been a method to the madness. Intrigued, I mapped out the first book, Vicious, and here's what I learned. Although Schwab darts around the timeline, there are some patterns to emulate. Instead of starting with the first act, an inciting incident, like most stories do, Schwab begins in the third act, but quickly jumps back to the first act, to the inciting incident, grounding us in the story. Essentially, she's making a promise that she will tell us how characters got from point A to point B. Just sit tight, enjoy the ride. From there, Schwab jumps back and forth between all 3 acts, but the focus is on Act 1. The majority of the time is spent there until Act 1 comes to a climax. Once Act 1 is mostly complete, we then turn our focus to Act 2, and around the middle point of the book, she gives us a climax to Act 2, even though we haven't gotten all of Act 2 yet. Are you following? It's a lot, but you're in luck because in the description down below there is a link to my research. You can use it to follow along with what I'm talking about, or you can use it as a deeper dive into this topic to really see how Vicious is split up. Once we've been given the climax of Act 2, there's kind of a shift in Vicious to the antagonist's story. Not every story will have this, but if your story is going to have a tonal change or some kind of maybe a point of view shift, I think the end of a traditional act is a good time to do it. It worked really well in this case. Even though we've already been given the climax of Act 2, the next 25% spends a lot of time in Act 2, but from the villain's point of view. There are a few occasional jumps back to Act 1, again from the villain's point of view, but most of the jumping now is between Act 2 and Act 3. Around the 70% mark, Schwab goes full throttle and the rest of the book is in Act 3. Any jumps at this point serve only to amp up the tension building in Act 3 towards the climax. The way this story is structured, the reader doesn't really experience the story with the characters, but instead become more of a detective trying to understand and figure out how these events took place. This research is all well and good, but without the story, it's hard to see really what's going on. So instead of spoiling everything for you guys, I wanted to use a more well-read and more well-known story. So I wanted to show what Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone would look like under this story structure. First off, the Sorcerer's Stone and Vicious are just completely different novels. Vicious spends about 40% of the novel in Act 3, whereas the Sorcerer's Stone only has 2 chapters in Act 3. I'm going to do my best to apply concepts, but this will not be perfect. To begin, we're going to start our new order of the Sorcerer's Stone close to Act 3. I chose to start with the Forbidden Forest 1 chapter before Act 3 technically starts to give us a 3rd chapter in Act 3. Next, we need to jump back to the inciting incident. I think the Diagon Alley chapter is a good fit, even though I wouldn't say it's actually the inciting incident of the actual novel. My main reason for choosing this is that it introduces the Sorcerer's Stone. It's the inciting incident of the main plot of the story. Hagrid is in both the Forbidden Forest chapter and in this chapter, which will aid in the fluidity. And Hagrid also gives a great explanation of Voldemort, which will really clue us into the conflict of this story. Next, we're going to jump back all the way back to The Boy Who Lived. Based on the narrative I've set up so far, I think this would be a good opportunity, a good time to introduce the Dursleys. And besides, this is the actual inciting incident of the Sorcerer's Stone. I think it would be bad to leave it for later. I don't know how well this chapter will work, taken out of order, especially because it's not in Harry's point of view. I don't know. I said this wasn't going to be exact. Because the fact that Harry is a wizard is already extremely spoiled at this time, I decided to go ahead and next up put the Vanishing Glass. Again, any later, and I'm worried that it loses its narrative significance. We need to skip forward again, so we're just going to go with the chapter right after the Diagon Alley chapter and go into platform 9 3/4. The next chapter will be the natural follow-up, The Sorting Hat. I'm not sure how the next chapter will land, but I think readers at this point will be wondering, how did Harry get from Dursley's to Hogwarts? So I think the next chapter needs to be Letters from No One. If you remember, Letters from No One ends with a countdown. I'm hoping that suspense and that tension holds as we do another timeline jump into our next two chapters, The Potions Master and The Midnight Duel. Then let's go back to that countdown with our final Act 1 chapter, The Keeper of the Keys. With Act 1 complete, it's time to start building towards a midpoint climax. I won't be using Act 2's climax like Vicious did because I've already used Act 2's climax, but I'm very excited for what I chose instead. First, we're going to jump back to Act 2 and watch Harry and Hermione defeat a troll in Halloween and discover Snape trying to get past Fluffy. This is my favorite part of the reordered novel because we're going to follow up Snape trying to get past Fluffy with the trio trying to get past Fluffy. In my opinion, that's an amazing climax. I gotta consult my phone because this is rapid fire. From here, we're gonna finish off Act 2 with Quidditch, Nicholas Flamel, Norbert the Norwegian Ridgeback, and finally the Mirror of Erised. You may have noticed I moved the order of these chapters around. I think moving the Mirror of Erised is a great setup for the reveals in the final chapter. In this chapter, we also see more interactions between Snape and Quirrell, as well as being introduced to how the Mirror of Erised works. We have completed Act 1 and Act 2, and now it's time to jump into the finale, the last chapter of Act 3, The Man with Two Faces. This isn't perfect by any means. Let me know in the comments what your reorganized version would look like. Seeing the structure is one thing, but applying it to your own story is a whole different ballgame. The problem I saw while working on the Sorcerer's Stone was that the first act is a lot about discovering magic, and starting anywhere but the beginning ruins that effectively. And I concluded that changing the structure of the book is going to change the reader's experience of the book as well. So to apply this to your own novel, I think that you would want to do it deliberately with a specific purpose in mind. I personally, when I'm planning out the story, would decide that I'm starting in the third act, and I would not take a novel that I'd already written and try to restructure it. At least I hope I would never do that. It sounds horrible. Potentially, I might write an outline in the chronological order, or maybe a zero draft even, just to get the correct order of events in my head. But I would do most of my revisions in the structure that I was planning for the story. It would help me be able to introduce things the way that I need to and do the reveals correctly. In the end, I mean, it's writing a novel is such a process, and you have so many revisions, you have to move scenes around. It would happen, but I think I would at least do my best to stick to the structure that I want to have in the end from the beginning. And especially because I've never tried this structure before, I think it would probably end up taking a lot of revision to get it right. Now that I've seen this alternate style, I'm obsessed with it, and I can't help but wonder, can this be done to an entire series? Hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so that you don't miss that experiment.